Wherever you may hail, I'm your host, John Bruni. Welcome to The Focus, where we bring you the most thought-provoking and informative current affairs analysis from around the world. Each episode, we invite top experts and analysts to share their insights on the most pressing issues of our time. Join us as we explore the complex and ever-changing landscape of the world, where we provide valuable perspectives on the events that shape our global community. Continuing on with our examination of international security, in this episode we'll be looking at what appears to be a deliberate effort to regrow German military power. Joining us for this topic is guest from Rome, Italy, Dr. Karl-Heinz Kamp. Karl-Heinz is an Associate Fellow of the German Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin and a lecturer at the University Roma III in Rome. As with last episode's special guest Ben Hodges and my good self, Karl-Heinz is also part of the Dutch-based The Alphen Group, or TAG, led by Professor Julian Lindley-French, whose mission is creating solutions for a secure Europe. A link to the TAG website will be displayed in the show notes for those who are interested in the work we do. But before we start, a shameless plug for ourselves. Please subscribe to our channel. We need the algorithm to find us, and by hitting the subscribe and like buttons, this is your contribution to the growth of what hopefully will become a South Australian global sensation. Karl-Heinz, welcome to The Focus.
Thank you very much. Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening.
Good evening, actually. Anyway, good morning to you, sir. Karl-Heinz, how does German Chancellor Olaf Scholz characterize Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and what implications does he draw from the invasion for the state of European order and for German foreign policy?
Well, first, I think it in the meantime has become known that Germany changed its security policy fundamentally after the attack of Russia on Ukraine. Something which few people expected, that a social democratic and a green government, which usually doesn't have the military issues in their DNA, was able to completely redirect Germany by defining Russia as a threat, which we didn't do for many years, by spending the hell of a lot of money on defense, on basically repairing all the things we forgot in the recent years and decades on our armed forces, and now having become the second largest after the US, the second largest supporter of Ukraine in civilian and in military means. And this is a fundamental change. And for this, Chancellor Scholz deserves credit. And for him and for the entire government, it was a learning experience from coming from a more, some people say, pro-Russian stance, which is historically determined, to a very firm, well, anti-Russian is a little bit placative, but very clearly defining Russia as a threat, as an imminent threat, and a threat which is going to stay with us.
But despite increased support for Ukraine and a pledge to bolster defense spending, I mean, what challenges does Germany face in transforming its military capabilities? They have been out of the game for a long time.
Well, we haven't been out of the game for a long time. Germany, by the way, was partly the second largest or the third largest troop contributor in Afghanistan for many years. So the German armed forces were there, alive and kicking, but for a completely different scenario. We had done away with military defense in Europe, believing that's no longer necessary, have changed our armed forces to small, mobile capacities, as I said, to be present in Afghanistan. And now we have to go back to all these old-fashioned, quote-unquote, heavy fighting capabilities. And this costs a huge amount of money. Germany put something on the table, but it becomes very clear that this is not enough. And this is very difficult in a country which was used to constantly increase social spending, and of course neglect the armed forces, believing that they are no longer necessary. And we are now in this challenge, on the one hand, convincing the public, yes, you have to spend more. And now they said, yes, but we did already. And then the message has to be, yes, but it's not enough. And this is a constant struggling, like I think in every European country which we have.
Karl-Heinz, was this actually a failure of the German political elite to understand that the fundamentals of history would eventually come back in some form? You know, and I think I can't cast aspersions too heavily on Germany. I think here in Australia, we did the same kind of thing. You know, during the War on Terror, we restructured everything. Everything was done to support counterinsurgency missions in Middle Eastern countries. Whereas in the 1980s, we tried, you know, defending Australia and, you know, having our defense forces spread across the north of the country. The short-sightedness of politicians, maybe political parties who favor non-military means, or at least not spending enough on a broad-based conventional deterrence, seems to be a Western malady of sorts. Would you agree with that?
Actually not, because it's easy with the blessing of hindsight to say, well, in the past, these and these mistakes have been made. I don't think that, for instance, Chancellor Merkel in the past had any illusions on the non-democratic character of Putin, for instance. However, first, yes, 9/11 was a major change in international security policy, and we all adapted to this. The fall of the Berlin Wall 10 years before was a major change in security policy, and we adapted to this. So now with the attack on Russia, with the attack of Russia on Ukraine, we have another fundamental change, I think comparable to the fall of the Berlin Wall or to 9/11, which requires a fundamental change. Did we make mistakes in the past? I'm not sure. I would regard myself a fairly conservative strategic person. Still, I would have never imagined, leaving alone that I always was convinced that the Russians are dangerous, but that they are ready to ruin their own country, and that's what they are doing. Ruin their own country in the future to follow any pipe dreams of a Russia great power or God knows what. This is something I couldn't imagine, and I think hardly anyone could imagine this. Second, the point, are democracies, and that's basically what you are hinting to, are democracies able to think ahead, to spend money in things which are not so popular? Hardly. We do always do little and always too late. There were many people who told us in the 1990s, if you don't spend more on the Balkans, this entire area will blow apart. Who was ready to convince its voters, because you have to be elected in a democracy, to spend more for Balkans where many people didn't even know where it was? Okay, so the same thing now, if there is no threat perception in the public, and we didn't have one in Europe, not only in Germany, but in most European countries, except Poland, except the Baltics, who have the historical experience. But we did not, and then it's very difficult to argue in favor of unpopular expenses, because at the end you need to be elected. So you have to find a balance. And apparently the balance was not correct. And now we are learning it on the painful way, as many countries are doing, as your country is doing. And now we have to pay the price. But this is not something unique, I think.
No, I agree with you on that. What key objectives are identified in the new defense policy guidelines, particularly regarding NATO, regional defense capability, and military aid to Ukraine?
Well, it's interesting that we have new defense policy guidelines. Germany, as I said, after this Zeitenwende, the fundamental title change in 2022, we did a number of things. First, we published a national security strategy, the first one so far. And then for the armed forces, we did these defense guidelines. The interesting thing is that in these defense guidelines, which are the first since, I think, 11 years, you will read the word war 15 times. it was never mentioned in any of the Bundeswehr documents, defense guidelines, or whatever we had in the years before. So you see the fundamental change there. And we have a defense minister who, fairly new defense minister, who since a couple of months now drums the term Germany has to be combat ready or war ready. Something that doesn't go well in the German public, by the way, but he sticks to it. Of course, this is very ambitious because, as you were saying, we are facing a huge number of problems in not having enough money, and money alone doesn't solve the problems. But you see a fundamental change. I mean, 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, a minister, regardless which one, who would have used the word war ready would have had to resign. So there's also this Zeitenwende in the meantime even arrived in the public, which is for Germany, which for historical reasons, I think for good reasons for our neighbors, was not that much in the military business anymore. We were, but that was not that successful. I think it's a fundamental change, and this is also reflected in this Bundeswehr guidelines. Ready to defend the territorial integrity of NATO. And this is fairly geographically limited, and we are ready now to send a brigade to Lithuania, to the Baltic states. And these are all the steps where you see it's not only hot air, it's not only words.
Karl-Heinz, in what ways does having former German Defense Minister Ursula von der Leyen as the 13th President of the European Commission help or hinder German ambitions to play a larger military role in Europe? I mean, she was defense minister at a time where the Germans were still pretty unprepared for what was about to happen with regard to the Russians over Ukraine. Is she an asset?
Well, at first, I think it is an asset to have your own countrymen or countrywomen in one of the key jobs at the EU, like at one of the key jobs, for instance, at NATO. So it helps in any case. Second, Ursula von der Leyen was a defense minister who tried to increase defense spending significantly. And actually, she was lost in the lurch by the entire then government, also by Chancellor Merkel. Because at that time, I mean, we in Germany, maybe like you in Australia, we had a very convenient life. We could spend money for social things. We had cheap Russian gas, which once again improved or bolstered our economic performance. No sane politician wants to leave this ideal world. And then someone who calls for matching the 2% of NATO, what she did strongly, wasn't that popular. So at the end, she failed, actually, not because of her failure, but because she didn't find the support. Now being at the helm of or at one of the helms of the EU, I think she proved that the EU became a strong security policy actor. Doing very well, actually, with regard to supporting Ukraine, organizing the energy supply for all European countries, doing sanctions, which is painful for the EU because we all pay for these sanctions. But the EU is not a military actor. So I think this old idea, which we always had of a European sovereign or autonomous defense policy, this is dead. The EU is a security policy actor, and in that sense, she helps a lot by understanding this. And military security will be done by NATO. And I think this is a new job sharing we will have to pursue, and I think she understands this very well.
So, despite the budget increases that have been promised so far, what analytical concerns are raised regarding the management of defense procurement and the efficiency within the Bundeswehr? So, you're going to go through a lot of organizational changes to support new, heavier equipment coming in numbers. How is this all going to come about?
Well, the problem is that first, Germany doesn't have a pure defense industry, like France, for instance, and leaving alone any state-owned defense industry. We have companies who do mixed products, among them defense. And if, like in the past, by the way, we also had a very strict policy on defense exports, also for historical reasons, which means if you are the company like Airbus, for instance, and you can sell civil aircraft and you can produce military goods. If the Bundeswehr doesn't buy enough military goods because our defense budget in the past was too low, if you are not allowed to export them due to our export regulations, you just cut on defense production lines. You build more production lines for the Airbus. Now, since we are switching, the industry is not quick enough to switch from, let's say, from butter to cannons, the old problems which we have. They do now because they realize there is money to make. And this is, sorry to say, this is what companies want to do, but this doesn't go overnight. So I think entire Europe is fairly successful or unsuccessful in managing this transformation, for instance, by building production lines in Ukraine for ammunition, something we couldn't think about a couple of times ago. Increasing, by the way, whenever you as a civilian German were buying stocks of defense industry, you were socially disregarded. We had German universities had a clause saying we do not research for defense industries. So it's an entire societal problem that's behind it, and this is going to change now. It goes. We could increase significantly defense production, but not that quickly. We have a very cumbersome procurement system in the armed forces, not at least to make sure that money is not wasted, there is no corruption, and so on and forth. But this is cumbersome. So also there we have to speed up things. Next point, also a sort of a holy cow. Our minister said one criteria of future defense procurement is speed. If I can buy something quicker off the shelf in the UK or in the US, shame for many Europeans, then we will do it. Difficult to understand for France, which has a state-owned defense industry and wants to, of course, support. So you see, it's a host of complex issues, which was a well-oiled or non-oiled machines for decades ago, and now you have to speed up the gears. And of course, the machine is a little bit cracking before it gets up to the new requirements.
Karl-Heinz, how does the global security landscape, including events such as the Ukraine war, the war in Gaza, including the Houthi actions in the Red Sea, influence the decisions to increase defense spending in Germany?
Absolutely a lot. I mean, there is, we first, I think the Germans, and we still have a majority for supporting Ukraine, for sanctions, even if that cost money. And we had the government a couple of months ago just discovered a huge gap in their budget, and they tried to cut everywhere. The only area where they didn't cut were defense spending, something unimaginable 2 or 3 years ago, because first there is the sensation in the public that the war by Russia is close. The distance from northern Germany to southern Germany is the same distance than from Berlin to Ukraine. So this is not Afghanistan happening somewhere. There is a perception of a threat, plus Russian nuclear threats, nuclear escalation, which is perceived. The people realize that China is not as benevolent as they thought in the past. They realize that Hamas was a terrorist act. Nothing happened like this since the Shoah, what Germans did to the Jews. So there are a number of, unfortunately, events which I think woke up not only the Germans but the entire Europeans. Yes, we still have some people who are saying, well, Hamas is not that clear, but in general there is a broad support. And as I said, you talk about the country which has the strongest anti-military protests in the 80s. You talk to a country where military was, for good historical reasons, always regarded negatively. You talk to a country when the wall came down, some of our soldiers resigned because there was always the rule in the Cold War, German armed forces will never be deployed. Okay, we have to take care of for peace. And when there was now the need to go in a combat mission on the Balkans, said, oh, wait a minute, no, we resign. So the change since then is fundamental. And of course, unfortunately, all these international events, Gaza is one of them, contribute to this wakening up. Yes.
You raised a lot of issues, many of which are embedded in some of the questions that I've got for you. So bear with me. You must have read my script somehow. I don't know how that happens, but anyway, what are the internal domestic factors that contributed to the political acceptance of higher defense spending among German politicians? We talked about the external perception of threat, which is always a driver, a key driver. But obviously, we also you mentioned the long-standing anti-militarism within the German public. So it takes more than just the manifestation of a threat on someone's borders for people to switch on and say, yep, I'm going to support the Bundeswehr now. My firstborn son is going to go into uniform, and that's it. It never works out quite like that. It's a lot more complicated. Are there elements of the AfD, for instance, the Alternative for Germany or for Deutschland, do they have a particular interest being a right-wing party to whip up a little bit of a nationalistic storm behind supporting the expansion of the Bundeswehr? Or is this now across the board, Social Democrat, Green, AfD, Christian Democrats, they're all speaking off the same song sheet?
Well, it is not that our extreme right, which we have, was particularly active on arguing in favor or against Bundeswehr developments. Their key issue is migration. So it's indeed an interesting question, what led to the famous Zeitenwende? First, it's important to understand, the change on the 27th of February, 3 days after the attack, when our chancellor announced the complete change of German policy. First, it was not a strategically assessed move. It was the last opportunity to make a U-turn, because otherwise the German car would have driven against the wall. Yeah. We were isolated in NATO with our position. The position of the US at that time, or the perception of the US on Germany, was terrible. So there was the understanding we have to do something, because Russia is really becoming dangerous, point one. Point two, it was not only a threat looming at a border, it was an outright war that started overnight, something which many people in Germany didn't believe in. Many people in the Ukraine didn't believe in. They thought, well, the Russians are threatening, but the Russians will shoot in their own knee, so they will not do it. Yes, they did. So I think it is indeed pretty much of a spontaneous awakening. And then it was done by the government, actually not by our chancellor. It was brought forward by our Minister of Finance, who, because in the recent years, we didn't have a demand of further German speeches on how to do more. We did it all the time, promised that we will live up to our role, to our economic relevance. The difference of the 27th of February speech was to put 100 billion euros on the table, just like this. And 100 billion is the hell of a lot of money. So that was the real title change. And that was a fairly spontaneous move, figured or fueled by the most recent developments, by the attack. I don't think that there was a long strategy discussion behind it before. So it was very spontaneous. And of course, the top of the government, the chancellor and defense and the finance minister, did this without consulting the parties. They didn't like it at all. They just made a fait accompli. And only afterwards they managed to drag in the support for all this. The Greens were shocked at the beginning. I mean, the Greens, an anti-military party. Today, by the way, interesting enough, Green politicians know the types of German tanks better than you and I. So this has become the most belligerent party in Germany. Also because what we always underestimate by talking about Greens, yes, they are wimpy on defense, yes, but they are a human rights party. And killing women and children in Ukraine is something that doesn't go well with the Human Rights Party. So you see a number of movements have contributed to this, but our extreme left and right didn't have that much to do. Our extreme left is still on the pro-Russia song sheet, saying, well, you know, it is justified. NATO was aggressive to Russia, which is ridiculous.
Yes.
But they are still in the minority.
Okay, so Defense Minister Boris Pistorius is riding high in public opinion polls. Have the German people truly turned a corner regarding how they view the importance of high military spending?
I was the last 4.5 years I spent in the German Defense Ministry as a special envoy of the minister. And whenever we got foreign delegations, that was always the question you just raised. Is the Zeitenwende lasting, or is it a flash in the pan? And I think it is lasting for 3 reasons. First, it's lasting because it was done by red-green, which means their evolution, the pains they had to go through were so strong that this means something. I don't think that a conservative party would have been able to do this. First point. Second point, we have a completely unusual consensus in the parliament on supporting Ukraine. We discuss upon the House and when, and Taurus long-range missiles, yes or not, but the basic consensus, we have to do everything possible for Ukraine, and we spent the hell of a lot of money for Ukraine, is there through the entire political spectrum. And I don't know any other issues which find so much bipartisan support. And the third element, very important, we were discussing this earlier, public support. The mood is completely different than in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea. I say, I know, Crimea is a little bit Russian, you know, they might have a reason to do it. And, you know, Ukraine is a difficult country, fairly corrupt, so let's stay out of this. Now it's completely different. So these 3 elements, of course, the pendulum will always swing back a little bit. But for these reasons, I think this Zeitenwende, with all its respect, defense spending, awareness, industry, defense exports, policies, is a lasting development, yes, which I hadn't expected actually 2 years ago.
Well, I have to say, I was only talking to my friends the other day, and we were having this discussion over coffee, and we were all very skeptical about what we were seeing. But then again, we also are about 5,000 kilometers away from Europe, so we're not in the inner circle, understanding all the things that are going on behind closed doors. It is good and very heartening to hear what you're saying, but it will lead to some very difficult questions further on. So let's just move slightly on from this. In the context of budgetary constraints and the need for efficiency, what strategies are suggested to ensure that increased defense spending is utilized effectively and transparently?
Well, I mean, we have a very cumbersome system. Let me make a general remark. We are always complaining of over-bureaucratization of our societies. The responsibility for this is us, because we want to know whether our food is produced in a nice way without using pesticides, whether our clothes are not done by children in Pakistan. So we put on the companies more and more bureaucratic burden to prove and to document all this. The same holds true for the defense business, where we wanted to make sure that money doesn't go in the wrong channels and so on and so forth. So this led to the system which we have. This means cutting this jungle, first and foremost, requires reducing our expectations in general. So we have to expect certain things. Also, things can go wrong if you spend money on defense like on any other things. Money disappears in black holes. Should not, but it happens. So a little bit more flexibility on this is necessary. Point one. Point two, actually, you cannot do that much wrong in Germany because the needs for the armed forces are so strong. Not only the big weapon systems, but we are talking about the equipment of the individual soldiers. We are talking about parkas, boots, clothing, night goggles. So whatever you buy, it is right. The downside of this is that whatever you buy, it is not enough. So and what people completely underestimate, because the question is, what happens if these 100 billion you put on the table once, what if they are spent? What if they are consumed up?
Yep.
We have a law in the German Bundestag. I'm not sure whether all parliamentarians really understood what they signed there, which says explicitly, if the 100 billion special money are consumed up, the German parliament, not the government, the parliament will provide a defense budget, I quote, sufficient to support NATO's planning goals. 2% will not be enough for this.
Right.
Okay. As I said, not sure whether all parliamentarians really understood this sentence, but it's written in a law. So I, as a German citizen, I have a chancellor who promised 3 times to meet the 2%. We have a national security strategy that explicitly says 2%, and this is a lot in Germany, given our GDP, 2%. And we have a law that says we will meet NATO's planning goals. How a government will do this in 2 or 3 years when we have to pay back the money for the corona loans, not my business. This is their business. But I, as a citizen, could say, sorry, guys, this is what you put in writing. And in that sense, I'm fairly optimistic.
Wow, I wish I was so optimistic about Australia, but anyway, that's another story for another time. I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast. And from Italy, we're speaking with Karl-Heinz Kamp, an associate fellow of the German Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin and a lecturer at the University Roma Tre in Rome. Karl-Heinz, what are some proposed strategies for Europe, particularly Germany, to address the potential withdrawal of US nuclear protection under potential future President Donald Trump?
Well, this is a discussion which we had recently here in Germany. Also, strange enough, by the way, we had a nuclear discussion in the last 20 or 30 years. So also this shows something. There is a reflex always in Germany and in some Western European countries. Whenever there's a crisis in the transatlantic relations, we talk about an independent European defense capacity, which never worked, by the way, because we were never willing to put the money required to build up these things. And now, for the first time, we even discussed this in the nuclear realm. First, I don't think that there's any serious alternative to a US extended deterrence capacity for Europe. But then your question is justified. Worst case, if Donald Trump tomorrow says, I will not jump in for these goddamn Europeans anymore. First, I don't think that deterrence disappears immediately, because deterrence doesn't take place only in my and your head. It has first and foremost to take place in the head of the potential aggressor. So can Vladimir Putin, if he hears Donald Trump saying this, can he be sure that first, in case of he is attacking Poland, let's say, Donald Trump, not a very coherent person, to put it mildly, will change his mind immediately by saying, no, I bombed the hell out of them? Can he exclude that France and UK, two small but not irrelevant nuclear capabilities we have in NATO, in the West, might act on their own? If Putin miscalculates, the damage for Russia will be incredible. So there is still more than just US extended deterrence. Of course, preferably, this is the one we have. But nuclear deterrence is pretty much a theological issue. You can believe in it or you cannot. So I would not like Donald Trump saying so, but I wouldn't jump out of the window if it happens, because there is still a way to go. And by the way, if whatever Donald Trump says on NATO and that he doesn't like it and he doesn't like Europeans, he can do heavy damage to the transatlantic relationship, yes. But I'm not sure whether he would be able to destroy 75 years of successful, grown transatlantic security cooperation with one pen strike. So yes, a Trump period would be difficult, damaging, but it will not be the end of NATO, and it will not be the end of US nuclear protection for Europe.
Karl-Heinz, do you think that there's a crisis in nuclear deterrence generally? I don't know. I mean, having observed what's happening in Ukraine at the moment, the amount of threats that get issued from semi-official sources out of the Kremlin saying that they're going to be using this, and they're going to be using that, with every passing threat, the likelihood of anyone actually reaching for the red button gets less and less over time, I assume. Now, of course, there's always the thing in the back of one's mind that, well, perhaps this time is the time that he's going to actually nuke something. But I think that going down that particular path, it becomes more difficult the more you kind of push it off to one side and the more you use it more as a rhetorical device. So, even from the Russian perspective, what are the use of the nukes if you're not going to use them and you're only going to be using them as a threat that is unlikely to be carried out? It's at the likelihood of use where deterrence has its effect. I mean, that's what kept the balance of terror going for the Cold War. I mean, the idea that the Soviets have nuclear weapons ready to rumble, as does the Western Alliance. And, if a particular crisis comes to a head, the likelihood of these things being deployed was a realism. Whereas now it doesn't seem to be real, not for the Russians. I'm not sure whether for the French. I'm even more doubtful about the UK, but I would say even for the Americans. What are your thoughts?
Well, first, I think that nuclear weapons or the threat of nuclear use is already useful for the Russians right now, even if they don't do it, because this keeps the West from intervening. We don't give certain weapon systems to Ukraine because we are afraid of escalation. Which, just do a counterfactual argument for a second. Imagine that Russia wouldn't have nuclear weapons. The West or NATO or the US would have long intervened and would have defeated Russia incredibly, okay? Because we discovered that they are not all 6 feet tall. So nuclear threat already had a value for Russia and further has. Is Putin going to use it? I don't know. The fact that it becomes less and less likely doesn't convince that much, because he did a stupid thing once already by attacking Ukraine. He might do a stupid thing once, even if I would tell him it doesn't make any sense. Whether he listens to me, I'm not that sure. If he feels himself painted in the corner. So this means we also should be a little bit careful on, yes, nuclear deterrence is important and relevant and it protects, but it's a darned dangerous concept. Unfortunately, we don't have an alternative, because the idea of a nuclear-free world, yes, would be nicer, but it doesn't fly. But so we have to live with this dangerous and contradictory concept, okay, which has huge credibility problems. Do I really believe as a German that the US is coming to help with nuclear weapons if we get attacked? Which means, do I believe that the US is risking San Francisco because they might get a counterstrike, that they're willing to risk San Francisco to save Berlin? I don't know, and I don't want to find out, by the way. So there are these inbuilt inconsistencies which we cannot escape. But they are all also inconsistency for Putin and for others, because he cannot exclude or include the same thing as well. So we have to deal with this imperfect system, but we shouldn't fool ourselves. It is a dangerous system and it can go wrong, either in Ukraine or by any, and whether I regard this as strategically sensitive or not to use them doesn't matter. He might do it anyway, or he might not. So there is still this this Damocles sword on our head, and there's no way to get rid of it.
How do differing political ideologies in Europe, such as those represented by Viktor Orban in Hungary, influence discussions on nuclear policy and security across Europe?
Well, I think we have two NATO allies where I'm not that sure whether they are NATO allies with regard to their policies, and this is Turkey and Hungary.
Yeah.
And by the way, these are not the countries, these are the governments who are acting that way. Both countries pose huge problems for NATO's unity in a number of issues with regard to supporting Ukraine, with regard to exporting goods to Russia, technical goods to Russia. Turkey is very good in this. In the nuclear realm, they don't play a major role. Turkey is theoretically a stationing country of US nuclear weapons, which in fact it is not, because there are no US nuclear weapons anymore. They have the walls, but not the systems. So they cause problems in a host of other NATO issues, but not in the nuclear realm. We do not have a huge nuclear debate in Europe. The most recent one in Germany was a surprise to most people. It popped up, brought up by people who don't know anything about this. That's why they made crazy proposals. One famous historian proposed, since the EU needs a nuclear capacity, but since we don't have a European government and we will not get one, he proposed seriously, famous guy, that every European country should get the red button for a while. So we hand it around from country to country. I mean, the idea that Viktor Orban is for a while at the nuclear button doesn't convince me that much. So you see, nothing is stupid enough to be brought up by someone who believes to be either prominent or knowledgeable. Maybe he's both not.
So what are the legal and treaty-related obstacles for Germany to pursue its own nuclear arsenal? I mean, there have been some suggestions that Germany would purchase weapons from the United States directly. I mean, I think that you raised it earlier. So what are the things that would prevent Germany from acquiring its own sovereign nuclear deterrent?
First, for decades, and it didn't change, we never had a debate in Germany on acquiring its own nuclear weapons. We had it in the 50s and 60s, but that was at a time when nuclear was connotated positively, when the women dreamed of the nuclear dry iron, but this is long over. So there is no political voice in Germany, and it hasn't been in the recent years, expressing these ideas. There are one or two, and only one or two academics who brought it up, and of course they find a lot of resonance. The reason why is because it would be disastrous with our past to do this, and we have indeed legal bans. We are a signatory state of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which accepts there's only the 5 nuclear powers have nuclear powers and all the others not. We signed this. We in the aftermath of German unification, we once again legally binding reconfirmed, in addition to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, that Germany never will strive for weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, and particularly not nuclear. And so there is no need, there is no political pressure, there is no discussion except these one or two people. So this is a non-topic which shouldn't be blown up.
I mean, in the absence of US nuclear protection, and hypothetically speaking, what are the arguments for and against France assuming a nuclear deterrence for Germany and other European Union member states? I mean, I know that France has been very big on always putting itself forward as the leader of post-World War II Europe. Do you see France having any major role in making up for the lack of an American extended deterrence at some time in the future?
Well, France very often raised the idea of, by offering talks on nuclear issues to Germany and to some other countries, particularly to Germany, they raised the idea that the French nuclear capacity, as small as it is, could be an alternative. However, this was never true because France, we were just talking a minute ago about these credibility issues of nuclear deterrence, extended deterrence, that you take a nuclear umbrella for one of your allies. It has tremendous credibility problems. And France said, and it's not stupid, it's a very sober analysis saying nuclear weapons are national weapons. This idea of extended deterrence doesn't fly. As they say in French, la nucléaire ne se partage pas. You cannot divide the nuclear. This is a very sober strategy, and this is why France acquired own nuclear weapons, not to be dependent on the US nuclear umbrella. They also did it because they have the idea of the grande nation, which is a little bit outdated, but by and large, the logic is we need our own deterrence capacity. If this is the case, then by definition, France cannot replace a US or whatever nuclear umbrella over Germany. That doesn't exclude that we shouldn't take up the offer of France. Let's talk about nuclear issues. Let's talk about plans, stationing, strategies, as we do in NATO. And let's take the Brits into this, the second major nuclear power in Europe, whether they're in the EU or not. And let's talk about, and let's take the Poles in and some other European countries, as we do in NATO, because we, as a non-nuclear ally, have an interest in knowing what our nuclear countries or neighbors intend to do, because we would be affected by this. But the idea of an alternative is something that doesn't go in principle because of French nuclear strategy, which makes sense, but does exclude extended deterrence.
Karl-Heinz, what about the strength? I mean, we spoke about the strength of the transatlantic alliance earlier, but I'd like to drill down a little bit more. There are plenty of Americans, both within Washington and in Europe, who do not share Trump's cavalier attitude on the importance of European defense and security. In our last podcast, we spoke to U.S. Army Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, retired, who expressed his deep concern about a new Trump presidency and the direction of the Republican Party generally. Do you think an isolationist Trump could cause a cultural split within the US military establishment, weakening America's global strategic commitments?
Well, he has done already in his first term. And he has done it not only in the US, but he has done it also in Europe, leaving alone what he concretely did, because at the end of the day, by the way, he didn't do that much damage to the European military. Ben Hodges, when at that time he was the commander in Europe, he got a lot of financial support from the US. Not sure whether the president knew about this, but what the Trump presidency did, and particularly almost the coup d'etat in Washington did, it weakened the role of the US as a model for democracy. I grew up, my generation grew up with this model role of the democratic country, the helm of democracy, protection, freedom. Difficult now to explain this to my kids or to my grandchildren in the meantime. And this is disastrous. And another Trump presidency, because, by the way, it is not only Trump. It is the fact that many of my friends, colleagues, my kids say, look, Dad, I mean, I lived in the US positively. They now say, wait a minute. I mean, if still 47% of the Americans are ready to vote for someone who, in my humble and layman assessment, is mentally sick, this is difficult to understand, and that is difficult to sell to people. So it is the general loss of authority, of moral authority of the US, of the West in general. We have our problems anyway, because we defend our Western values whenever we like them. And whenever we don't like them, we are not sticking to them that much. All of us, by the way, not only the US.
Oh, yeah.
So it is but certainly a Trump government could do major harm. As I said earlier, I don't think that they can fully destroy, because he or the government, the MAGA government, would have 90% of the US security establishment against them. And we, for instance, had in the first Trump term that the then US Chief of Staff Milley said publicly in a hearing that he would not have followed a Trump order to use a nuclear weapon.
Mm.
So could he have prevented this? I don't know, but just to indicate that, yes, the president has absolute power, but even the absolute power has some limits. Am I happy? Would I be happy about a Trump presidency? Not at all. Would be really difficult. But I think we could survive provided the Europeans do what they have to do, make ready for their own defense, because we might be in a situation that we have to defend against Russia regardless who is in the White House, because the US is shifting its interest for very good reason to the Asia Pacific. And if we assume that Russia is losing conventional military capacities, is losing its economic base, is going down the drain significantly, still remaining in a dangerous aggressor, Europe might be in a position in a couple of times, including Ukraine, by the way, with a combat-hardened army, to defend against Russia on its own, or with only very limited US defense. But if this happens, I would like to decide this in a consensual way in NATO, and not by a president who just withdraws in an aggressive way.
Okay. I agree with everything that you say, but there is something that's sticking in my craw. I'm going to have to let it out. But isn't this an ironic position? Because really, in the first Trump presidency, he made such a big drama about how European nations were dropping the ball in terms of their own internal defense expenditures before the Russians manifested their threat. So didn't he actually, in a perverse kind of way, get what he wanted? I mean, okay, Putin played his role. No one's taking his responsibility away from how Europe is responding. But it all started under the first Trump administration. It was all about Trump saying, you Europeans aren't putting enough effort into matching American defense expenditure. And guess what's happening now? 18 NATO states have hit the 2% mark of GDP. Germany is now starting to march ahead. It looks as though Europe is all coming together in a way. Was it because of Trump's threats, his deal-making capacity, which everyone keeps mythologizing? I mean, was it because he was the scary guy in the room that went boo and everyone jumped?
Well, first, Donald Trump was right in his complaints in his term that the Europeans are still subsidized by the US, and the economies of the Europeans are doing partly better than the American ones. So it's absolutely understandable to say the US taxpayer is no longer willing to pay for your inconsistencies. That was absolutely right. The problem is that at that time, the Europeans didn't change. We did not spend that much more at that time. Unfortunately, we should have done. We were fiddling the figures a little bit on trying to convince him that the Europeans did more, but we did not. Yep. We only started doing more with the attack of Russia on Ukraine. That was the watershed. Trump was right, as all his predecessors were right. In 2011, the then US Defense Minister Gates gave a very thorny speech in June in Brussels. It could have been done by Trump. The same wording, more or less, complaining about these goddamn Europeans who don't do what they should do. So that was right for a long, long time, but only now with this catastrophe, with the threat we were talking about earlier, Europeans are changing. And still, by the way, hard to say, we still have rich European and North American countries who are not doing enough. Norway, one of the richest in Europe, 1.4 something. Italy, where I live, I'm a German living in Italy, as you can see from the nice Colosseum there.
Yes.
Not doing enough. For Canada, not poor, not doing enough. Spain, you name it. So there are still many countries who find all kind of excuses for something which is not excusable. So the fact that the Eastern Europeans, the Poles and the Balts, do that much more is due to their closeness. And I mean, if Latvia spends 3% of its GDP, it has to be complemented, but it's not that much at the end in euros or dollars. If France spends, or if Norway would spend 2%, this would help. So there is still a long way to go. And we Germans now, for the first time since 15 years, we are making this. Now we can speak up for the first time. I don't have to feel ashamed for my own country. And now we have a chancellor. I mean, we have a social democratic chancellor, Scholz, who is encouraging and pushing the other nations to do more.
Yep.
Just forgetting that we didn't do enough for the last 15 years. So there are many ironies in this business, yes.
Okay, just one more on Trump before I move on to something that is related to what you've just mentioned. A second Trump administration doesn't expect to have as many adults in the room as the first one. There were the General Mark Milley's, there were the Mark Espers, there were the Rex Tillersons, and even, God bless his cotton socks, John Bolton, who tried to pull Trump back from his excesses and succeeded to a great degree. In a second Trump administration, it doesn't look like he's going to be surrounded by anyone other than yes men, 100% from top to bottom, which means that the likelihood of him doing far greater damage, not only to America's international and strategic relations, but also to the American system, is quite profound. How do you see it? Do you see it from that perspective as well?
No, this is certainly a damage that there's certainly a danger that the next Trump administration will be more professional in Trump terms.
Right.
And people like Mr. Grenell, as a foreign minister, I met him a couple of times as an ambassador in Berlin. He's a very smart person. He's not an idiot. And smart is not a term which I would put on Donald Trump, but he is definitely, and many other people are. So yes, there is the danger of much more professionalism, of not losing time the first 2 years in changing key personnel every 2 weeks. Yes, so that's a danger, and this is bad. The good news is, and I think the bad news is bigger than the good news, but there's a tiny good news, and this is, at the end of the day, a Trump administration will have only a little more than 2 years to do their destructive work. They still have to come into running, which takes a time, and the last a little less than a year, there will be lame duck. So more or less 2 years remain. You can do a lot of damage in 2 years for the US, for Europe, for the international relations. But as I said, and maybe it's a little bit like the whistling in the wood, we say in Germany, that it's a little bit just having the hope. I don't think that he can destroy it completely. And as I said, it is not only the government, it's also the so-called deep state, which is still there. There is a security establishment, which is still there. In the meantime, there's legislation in the US that leaving NATO can only be done with the support of Congress. So does this make me sleep well? Not necessarily. Does it make me stay at night the whole day? Not either.
Okay. Getting back to what you were saying earlier about how some rich European countries, Italy, Spain, aren't doing enough, is there a legitimate case to be made that perhaps the countries of the Mediterranean see European security very differently from, say, for instance, Germany or the Eastern Bloc or the Nordic Bloc? You know, they see Russia as the clear and present danger. If you're in Rome or if you're in Madrid, you would probably see African immigrants as being your number one, or your Arab immigrants being your number one security problem. And they probably have structured their defense forces to interdict illegal people smuggler traffic across the Mediterranean. And they don't see the Russians as the same sort of boogeyman as other countries closer to the Russian border do. Is that an excuse for them to not do enough to help out the other Europeans further north and east of them? Or is it actually a legitimate thing that they must consider?
Well, I think it's both. First, it is normal that Portugal is less concerned about Russia than Poland, just for geographical reasons. And the same holds true for Italy and for France and for Spain and for Greece. Still, interestingly enough, by the way, that the Italian government now is very strong on supporting Ukraine against Russia. But I mean, this is not your issue. The issue is that we, for years, have in NATO an East-South divide.
Yeah.
That the southern countries say, well, all the money needs to go to the south because there is where the danger is. Whereas the southerners say, wait a minute, our security concerns, as you were just saying, are different. They are lying south of the Mediterranean Sea. The problem is, and NATO now tried to bridge this gap by what we call the 360-degree approach. NATO tries to deal with all security threats.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that this is just a blunt lie. NATO is not able to do so because the difference is, and this is something where the Southern Europeans are a little bit trapped. Their concerns are justified: migration, instability, terrorism, you name it.
Yep.
But this is not NATO's core competence. The threat from Russia is a linear military threat, which you can answer with linear military means. This is what NATO can do. Mm-hmm. NATO is not well suited to deal with terrorism. What do you expect to do? NATO or military forces, you can also put it on the NATO, on the individual country side. Italian military forces are not well suited to deal with terrorism or migration. What NATO or military forces can do, they can support. They can supervise, they can provide situation awareness, they can do all kinds of things, but NATO cannot escape this trap of facing the problem that the Southern European countries spend money in the common NATO pot, but don't get the same security back as the Eastern Europeans get from NATO. It is a little bit self-betrayal that NATO officially defines the two major threats for NATO is Russia and terrorism. Even if it's true, NATO can deal with Russia. NATO cannot deal with terrorism. After 9/11, NATO did a couple of things, checking ships in the Mediterranean. Doesn't that much on terrorism. So this is a divide which we will hardly able to bridge. And so it will remain with us. So there will, for instance, now to bridge this, the NATO Supreme Allied Commander Europe, he has 3 regional plans, military defense plans for the East, North, Medium, South. He added a 4th one for the South, but this more or less includes common exercises and so on. So it's once again a compromise. We do a plan for you for the South, but it's not as much as defense as we do with the other 3. It's more about common exercises, common activities. So you see where the problem is. It will be a compromise. Still, at the end of the day, also France, but particularly Spain and Italy have to do more for their military. Leaving alone. So I don't think that they see this as an excuse. The excuse is still, as we always had, we need the money for something else. Right. So we are not willing to reset priorities. And this takes, I mean, a country like Norway is not lacking money. It is not willing, for all kinds of reasons I don't have to comment, to redirecting or resetting the priorities.
All right. Karl-Heinz, prior to German unification in 1989, there was a lot of concern about whether the idea of unification would be a good thing for Europe and the European balance of power. As Germany unified, it paid the peace dividend, which you made mention earlier, and all but disarmed and disengaged from playing a significant military role on the continent. How do you think Europe will see Germany's renewed commitment to higher military expenditure? With relief or with some worry?
This was always a German excuse many, many years ago when we were not willing to spend more for defense. We say, the Europeans might not like it. They might be concerned of a new Third Reich coming up. Actually, many, many years ago, the then Polish defense, then Foreign Minister Sikorski said, I am more concerned about Germany's weakness than about Germany's strength. So that was never an argument, particularly not in the recent years after unification. There were some concerns right at unification, particularly in the UK and in France, of any new growing German nationalism. It didn't fly. It didn't come out like this. And today there is no concern at all. On the contrary, all saying if Germany does more, it helps us. So I don't hear a single voice, not even in the extremes of the political spectrums in, let's say, France or the UK or Italy, being concerned about Germany. No, they say you do more. And many say, no, if you do more, we can step a little bit back. So this is also one of the excuses. So no, this is certainly not an issue anymore. I think it never was, seriously. And now it is definitely not one.
Okay, but if you look at the balance of power, Germany's eastern neighbor Poland has committed itself to developing a powerful conventional force deterrent against Russian aggression. Measured against Poland, will Germany want to match or exceed Warsaw's military capabilities? And how will that actually affect relations between those two countries? I mean, you said that, if Germany steps up, Poland can reduce, but I don't think Poland is in the mood to reduce. They've committed themselves to an armed force of 300,000. They're well on their way to get there. They're making deals with the South Koreans on some very sophisticated armored forces and artillery systems coming through. Is there not some sort of differential that we have to be mindful of between Berlin and Warsaw as they start grappling with military expansion plans?
First, I didn't say that Poland might step back. There are some others in Europe who might step back. I don't know. So Poland is completely out. Yes, we had problems between Germany and Poland, but that was a problem between the governments. It was particularly a non-democratic government in Poland, which did some very weird things, which didn't go well. And by the way, they didn't succeed well in the EU. For a while, Poland was regarded as an ally of Orban, so that was the same thing. Now we have a new government in Poland, which tries to go back to Poland's traditional democratic structure. The EU has already taken note of this and has given money which was blocked for anti-democratic behavior in Poland, so I'm very optimistic on this. Between Germany and Poland, I think, never was, and there shouldn't be a competition on military issues. My goodness, I mean, Poland is closer to Russia, so and they are concerned for historical reasons about Russia, and they were, for good reasons, annoyed about German policy taking gas through the Nord Stream 2 pipeline because it was convenient for us, ignoring the interests of the Eastern Europeans. That was a major mistake we Germans did. And of course, Poland and others were annoyed about this for good reasons. So now, being in a new world, I think this is something we can, that is already overcome and will become further overcome in the next years. Poland is doing in many cases better than we with regard to the military, putting these priorities much stronger than we do for good historical and geographical reasons. But I think we are singing from the same song sheet when we say, for instance, after 22, military deployments at NATO's eastern border are no longer only for deterrence purposes as a tripwire, but we all bring combat capabilities there. Poland does, and Germany does, by bringing in an entire brigade to Lithuania. Will be difficult, cost a lot of money, will take time, but we will have a combat brigade in Lithuania. And I think this is something the Polish people pleases, certainly the Baltics. So, and there is no competition. There are some issues on, for instance, stationing of nuclear weapons. There's a justified question of whether US nuclear weapons should be further stationed in Holland as they are now, or in Italy as they are now, or better not in Poland, or maybe in Ukraine, once Ukraine joins the alliance. But this is a completely different strategic debate, which we will have sooner or later. But this is not something that causes negative competition or tensions between the two countries.
Now, switching to something that's very close to my heart, especially from an Australian perspective, but I see the same sort of dynamics pretty much all over the West. Germany's active workforce is declining, so is its population. Not being a natural immigration state like Australia, Canada, or the United States, its capacity and willingness to absorb vast numbers of non-German people is questionable. How does an aging and declining nativist population hope to overcome problems regarding recruitment and retention of personnel for the Bundeswehr? Also, where will Germany get the skilled people necessary to run an expanded defense industrial base to support the growth of the Bundeswehr?
Well, democratic nations live nicely and well, and they get fat and they get tired and they get on like this until they come to a point where this nice being fat doesn't work anymore. We had this in Germany in 2005, where we had the same problems: lacking workforce, strong power of the trade unions. At that time, migration was not so much an issue, but a high level of unemployment. And the then government took a number of very painful steps. For instance, reducing the payment for unemployed to encourage them to take a job, and a number of other issues that kicked us a little bit out of our laziness. Germany, like many other industrial countries, is now at the same position. The recent years went very well before 2022, and we got lazy and fat. We worked less, all home office, perfect, nice and fine. In Germany, in the meantime, the social support for unemployed comes close to what you would earn as a baker or as a plumber. So many plumbers ask themselves, why the hell shall I work every morning? I do a little bit black working for the old lady and I repair their tubes, and this is it. So I think we need now this new step, and it's happening already. It's happening already that we realize we have to reduce our social expenditures. Painful, takes a while, not fully accepted yet, but you see the direction going there. We have to work more. We have to change the migration issue. We always had this illusion: migrants come, they integrate automatically. All those people coming from Syria are doctors. No, they are not. And the people from Afghanistan, they are not. And we have to force certain requirements on them. Years ago, when there was the idea migrants should learn German when they come to Germany, our left-wing party said, this is a Germanization by force. You cannot do this. Today, of course, they have to learn Germany, for God's sake. So all this takes a while. But since the pressure rises of increasing numbers of migrants, lacking workforce, some of the migrants are educated, but then you have to deal with recognizing their university degrees and so on. So all the practical issues. If we get this done, and apparently the pressure is, apparently in the past, the pressure wasn't big enough to take care of this. But now with problems not only in the Bundeswehr, but problems in the entire German industry, we want to do huge climate change projects. Yes, but you need an industrial base for this. The people like to have more leisure time. Our trade unions are supporting the idea of working 35 hours a week for the same salary. Sorry, guys, doesn't go. So these are very practical things, and the situation now, that's why the coalition in Germany is so heavily fighting among each others, because they know that they have to change priorities. They know that they have problems with their electorate. They know that the policies that the parties are not ready to follow. I think in a year or so, we either have a new government, regardless which one, or this government managed the same Zeitenwende as they did in the military field, which no one had expected in Germany. And I was in the ministry seeing these things, how painful it was for the acting politicians. I think we will need such a Zeitenwende, a tidal change also in the industrial, social, workforce, migration policy. We are on the way to this, but since no one has a crystal ball and no one has a silver bullet, it will take a little while. But since the pressure increases, I mean, our Minister of Economy 2 weeks ago said the situation of the German economy is disastrous. Sorry, sir, it is your job to change this. This is why you are the Minister of Economy, right? Or do I get something wrong? So apparently there is the awareness of the problem, and now a coalition of 3 very different parties is struggling on how to do it, having their old recipes of the past, which might not work anymore, and not being ready to enroll on the new recipes, whatever the new recipes are.
Okay, but all of this doesn't address the question that Germany is in a demographic deficit or a demographic decline. It's been, I'm paraphrasing from other people who are much more into that particular view. But, there are certain things that the country can't do because the workforce is aging, and you do need a certainly younger, skilled base to undertake a lot of the technical work necessary in industry, whether it's in support of defense industry, I would argue, particularly if it's a support of defense industry or any other part of the economy. Where are those people coming from? Because as your workforce ages, and you're not bringing in the migrants, because you would need to bring in lots and lots of migrants from all sorts of places, some of whom will cause great headaches in terms of getting, original certificates and doctorates and various other bits and pieces recognized. That's a big transition. And I'm not sure whether Germany or any other European state could possibly do that well.
Well, I mean, this is a problem we all have in Europe. Entire Europe is aging.
Yeah.
I mean, particularly here in Italy, it is much worse than in Germany, but still the problem is there. So I think there are a number of. I'm not an expert on this, so take it with a grain of salt. And it's always easier said than done. But first, fortunately or unfortunately, Germany is cannibalizing a little bit the other countries. So particularly there are many Italians not finding jobs paid jobs in Italy, who come to Germany, and we take them because they're excellently educated. It's unfortunate because this causes a brain drain in Italy and in other southern countries. The same holds true for Romania, Bulgaria, all the other weaker European countries. So this is not a solution. The second point is we have to work more. We have increased already the pension age to 67. In some countries like France, still impossible to think about. And maybe we go even higher. We now make it possible by permitting pensioners to take jobs and to make money. So you don't get your pension cut if you work for tiny things, which make someone who has worked for 40 years in a coal mine should have his pension peacefully. He deserves it. But many people, particularly in technical jobs, in high qualified jobs, would like to do a little more, use their skills they have learned, so give them the chance to do. Third point, make migration, as I said, easier said than done, demand-based. We pick the people we would like to have. Yes, there are some requirements and obligations we have to follow for humanitarian reasons, but no, we don't have to take everyone coming in. We don't. So if we, like other countries have, I think Australia has it, but certainly US has it, Canada has it, a system of picking those you want to have and make it attractive for them to come. There's still a huge of things to do, which has to do with language courses, with financial support, with, as you were saying, recognizing a university. In that sense, we are terribly bureaucratic, and university degrees, education, and so on and so forth. Let them be educated here, my goodness. So there are, and the industry is ready for this. Industry is ready for this, and now I'm speculating. I think much of the skepticism we have on migration in Germany and other countries is not against them. We had a huge solidarity with Ukrainians coming to Germany. We had 1 million coming to Germany after the war, because these people were, sorry to say, Western in the sense they could be, as far as whenever they spoke English, they could be integrated, they could interact much easier. You didn't hear that much criticism to Ukrainian migrants. You heard much criticism for those being still after a year in the camps, not speaking the language, having parallel societies, which we have. So I think there are pragmatic reasons to do, but this requires killing some of the holy cows. And killing holy cows is always something which is really difficult and really hard to do.
Multiculturalism. Oops, did I say that out loud? Oh, sorry. Look, it sounds like you're speaking not just for your country, but for many countries, including my own. But there you go. We can have that conversation off air. Look, final couple of questions, if you don't mind. And I really appreciate the fact that you've been on for as long as you have, Karl-Heinz. So French President Emmanuel Macron recently floated the idea that European military forces could be deployed in Ukraine to assist the armed forces of Ukraine in its fight against Russia. How much of this was deliberate hyperbole designed to provoke a reaction from European capitals? Or do you see that in time, European states in different strategic configurations may have to move outside the bounds of NATO restrictions if they want to achieve a proactive European defense?
Well, I think you are now connecting a number of issues. European defense proactive doesn't have, in my view, not that much to do with putting forces on Ukrainian soil. First, the French president is known for sometimes, my personal interpretation, talking first and thinking then. Not unusual for politicians, but he was the one who called NATO brain dead at a time when NATO was everything but brain dead. He made a number of weird statements. Sometimes you might believe that this is to cause, that this was intentional to cause a debate. Maybe it just slipped out of the mouth. So this proposal is something, whether it makes sense or not, it's not going to fly, because you don't find a single support, neither in NATO, not even Poland was suggesting this. Because there is this overall concern, and it's particularly in the US and particularly in Germany, justified or non-justified, on potential escalation of the war to NATO territory. Right. And in that respect, Chancellor Scholz and President Biden are absolutely on the same song sheet. As I said, justified or not, I don't know. And I don't want to find out, by the way, because if they are right, then we have a problem. So having said this, there is no appetite, and I think there's no need to put forces on to provoke Russia by doing these things. I would wish that, because Ukraine has proven that they can use delivered military material in a responsible way, I would hope that countries like the US, but also Germany, would give up their limitations, their restrictions with regard to delivering certain military means, because of being concerned of escalatory powers like long-range missiles and so on. But that's a different debate. I think we will do this sooner or later, as we did everything sooner or later, after having debated first on the Leopard tanks and on artillery pieces. So if we take the need serious, if we take our conviction serious that the Ukraine has to be supported, then we have to do this. Personnel on the soil is just not in the cards. It's once again one of these strange debates which pop up, and then they complete, like the European nuclear capacity with a button in every country. It's honestly, it's just not worth debating this. whether in the long run I could foresee anything like this after a ceasefire, let's imagine, where we might have a separation of Ukraine in a Russian-occupied part and in a Western part, and we Germans know what we are talking about, maybe. But for the time being in war, I don't see this.
Just one final cheeky question I've got to get in because I should have added that one to the earlier one, but conscription in Germany, is that something that's going to fly?
It's an interesting question. The first conscription, just for the people in Australia, we had conscription for many, many years. I'm a conscript. We did not abolish it. We just put it on hold. That's important to understand. So we are not reinventing, if we would, the conscription, but we would just restart the conscription system. Important difference. For many years, that was a non-debate because there were many arguments for conscription, that you get the armed forces better embedded in the society, you get more promising people because they might go for these 18 months and might say, oh, well, it's not that bad. So we had a president, a federal president years ago, Mr. Herzog, who gave a very important speech saying at that time, conscription can only be justified by security policy needs. So all these nice to have things are important, but it has to be a need. And for many years, until 2022, there was no need. And now there's a discussion, do we have the need again? Initially, when the discussion popped up, I thought it will not take speed because just restarting this entire system of conscription takes so much money and would occupy so many capacities, also military capacities, which we need much more urgently for our brigade in the Baltics, that we will not do it. Now, I heard from the Ministry of Defense that after they just have published these new defense guidelines, that was their major project now, published, I think, 2 months ago. Now these respective branches in the ministry are now seriously discussing these issues. Seriously discussing means open-ended discussion. The result of the discussion can be not worth it, too expensive, we don't have the structure, not doable, or it can be, yes, we should do it. We have one legal problem in Germany, namely, we cannot do, because there was always the proposal, if you don't do conscription, why don't you have a general mandatory social service? Like John F. Kennedy asked, don't ask what the country gives for you, ask what you can do for your country. Every German, he or she, is obliged to do 1 year or whatever social service. Can be in the military, can be in a social area, can be God knows where. The problem is that for constitutional reasons, we are not allowed to do this. Because since in the Third Reich, that was mandatory, our constitution forbids mandatory forced services except conscription.
Right.
So the only thing we could do is conscription, unless we change our constitution, which is difficult. And if we do conscription, we have one question. In the past, conscription was only for men. Now we have women in the armed forces. What does this mean? Do we make it mandatory once again for both sexes? Then we are close to a forced service forbidden by the Constitution. Or do we it only for the men and then say, wait a minute, we have women in the armed forces. So these questions are now seriously analyzed in the defense ministry. I was surprised that they are so serious about this. For the time being, in the public, it is not an issue. It's debated, but I think it's not urgent, because even if the answer would be yes, the time to implement all this will be significant. And it will be accompanied then by discussion. But as I said, the defense minister is actively pursuing it.
Interesting times, that's for sure. Karl-Heinz, thank you for joining us and for sharing your insights on the focus.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Associate Fellow of the German Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin and a lecturer in the University Roma Tre in Rome, Italy, Dr. Karl-Heinz Kamp. And to our audience, thanks for tuning into the Focus podcast. We hope that you found today's discussion enlightening and thought-provoking. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to reach out to us on social media. You can find the Focus on Facebook, referenced on the John Bruni and Sage International LinkedIn pages, and on Twitter, or on the Sage International website, sageinternational.com.au, by clicking the media drop-down menu and hitting podcasts. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and or leave us a review on your favorite platform. My thanks to our stalwart production team of Malcolm Hughes and Neil Smart, and to the team at the Ozcast Network. We hope that you'll join us again as we continue to delve into the most pressing current affairs issues of our time. Until then, stay informed and stay engaged. I'm John Bruni, and from Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.